In 2015, a 31-year-old woman was worth $4.5 billion. She wore the same black turtleneck every single day. She spoke in an unusually deep voice. She was compared to Steve Jobs by some of the most powerful people in America. Her company was valued at $9 billion. Her board of directors included two former US Secretaries of State, a former Secretary of Defense, and a sitting US Senator. She claimed to have invented a machine that could run comprehensive blood tests, the kind that normally required multiple vials drawn from a vein using just a few drops of blood from a simple finger prick. It was a genuinely exciting idea. Blood testing is often the biggest barrier to early disease detection. People avoid it because it's uncomfortable, expensive, and slow. If Holmes could actually build a machine that made testing fast, cheap, and painless, it really could transform medicine. Holmes used her family's education trust to found the company that would become Theranos. She idolized Steve Jobs, and it showed. She started wearing black turtlenecks every single day. She adopted an unusually deep speaking voice. She built a company that operated in near total secrecy, revealing almost nothing about how her technology actually worked. And it was mesmerizing. By 2010, Theranos had raised over $92 million in venture capital. Holmes recruited an extraordinary board of directors: former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. People with immense credibility and virtually no experience in blood testing technology. In 2013, Theranos partnered with Walgreens to bring its blood testing technology into stores across America. Holmes promised that Theranos tests would soon be available within 5 miles of every household in the country. By 2014, Forbes named Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. Her company was valued at $9 billion. There was just one thing nobody outside the company knew. The machine, called the Edison, barely worked at all. Behind Theranos's closed doors, the reality was completely different from the story being told to investors, partners, and the public. The Edison device was supposed to run hundreds of different tests from a tiny sample of blood. In practice, it could reliably perform only a small handful of tests, and even those results were often wildly inaccurate. So, what did Theranos do? Instead of admitting the technology wasn't ready, the company secretly used conventional blood testing machines purchased from other manufacturers like Siemens to process the actual samples. Patients believed their blood was being analyzed by revolutionary Theranos technology. In reality, it was often being run through the same commercial machines available to any lab in the country, sometimes diluted or modified in ways that produced unreliable results. Employees who raised concerns were pressured into silence. Internal critics were isolated, intimidated, or fired. And the deception went beyond the lab. According to federal prosecutors, Holmes told investors that Theranos technology was being used on the battlefield by the US military to treat wounded soldiers. It wasn't. She showed investors validation reports bearing the logos of major pharmaceutical companies, falsely implying those companies had endorsed the technology. They hadn't. Perhaps the most audacious deception of all came during a visit by then Vice President Joe Biden. Theranos staged an elaborate ruse. Biden's blood sample was drawn and in front of him appeared to be loaded into an Edison machine. In reality, it was secretly sent to a conventional machine hidden elsewhere in the building. When the accurate results came back, employees quietly fed them back into the Edison display to complete the illusion. Biden was impressed. He had no idea what he'd actually witnessed. For years, this is how Theranos operated. A company built almost entirely on convincing powerful people that impossible things were happening behind a curtain nobody was allowed to look behind. The cracks began to show from the inside. In 2014, two young Theranos employees, Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, and Erica Chung, began noticing something deeply troubling. Employees were manipulating statistical data to hide the Edison machine's poor accuracy. Test results being sent to real patients were often unreliable, sometimes dangerously so. Erica wrote directly to federal regulators, triggering a surprise inspection that uncovered serious violations at Theranos' lab. Tyler Schultz took a different route. He reached out to a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carrieru. Carrieru spent months investigating, building sources inside and outside the company. In October 2015, he published a bombshell exposé revealing that Theranos wasn't using its own technology for most patient tests and that its Edison devices produced unreliable results. Theranos fought back hard. The company threatened Carrieru and its own former employees with lawsuits. Holmes denied everything publicly, insisting the reporting was false. But the dam had broken. Walgreens suspended its partnership. Federal regulators, alarmed by the surprise inspection findings, banned Holmes from operating a blood testing lab for 2 years. Investors who had poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the company, including media mogul Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family of Walmart, began to demand answers. The SEC launched a fraud investigation. In 2018, Holmes and her former partner and Theranos president, Ramesh Balwani, were formally charged with wire fraud and conspiracy. By June 2018, crushed under the weight of lawsuits and investigations, Theranos dissolved completely. A company once valued at $9 billion, worth nothing. Elizabeth Holmes' criminal trial began in 2021, one of the most closely watched corporate fraud cases in American history. Prosecutors laid out count by count the scale of the deception. False claims about pharmaceutical validation, fabricated military partnerships, misleading financial projections, and a Walgreens rollout that Holmes knew was failing every day as she promised investors it would soon expand to 900 locations. Holmes' defense argued she was a true believer, a young, inexperienced founder who genuinely thought the technology would eventually work, not a deliberate fraudster. The jury didn't fully buy it. In January 2022, Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of investor fraud and conspiracy, though acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients directly. In November 2022, she was sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. Sunny Balwani, tried separately, was convicted on all 12 counts against him and received an even longer sentence, nearly 13 years. Together, they were ordered to pay over $450 million in restitution to defrauded investors. In May 2023, Elizabeth Holmes reported to a minimum security federal prison in Bryan, Texas, to begin serving her sentence. The woman once called the next Steve Jobs, the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history, was now an inmate. The Theranos story gets told, often, as a story about one charismatic founder's lies. But that framing misses something important. Elizabeth Holmes didn't fool the world alone. She was surrounded, year after year, by some of the most powerful and experienced people in America. Former cabinet secretaries, seasoned investors, media titans, and almost none of them demanded to see independent proof that the technology actually worked. They saw a compelling founder, a revolutionary vision, a board full of famous names lending credibility to each other. And in an industry that rewards bold promises and punishes skepticism, very few people wanted to be the one to ask the uncomfortable question, does this actually work? This is what makes Theranos different from a simple story about corporate greed. It's a story about how an entire ecosystem, venture capital, corporate boards, the media, even government officials, can collectively choose belief over verification, especially when the story being told is one they desperately want to be true. The technology never worked, but the story worked perfectly for over a decade. And that's the most unsettling part of all. The next Theranos won't look like fraud from the outside either. It will look like vision, like innovation, like the future. Until eventually, someone finally asks, does this actually work? Theranos wasn't a story about financial engineering like Enron or FTX. It was something rarer, a fraud built entirely on belief, charisma, and a story too good to question. If you want to understand how these collapses keep happening in every industry imaginable, subscribe. New financial collapse every week. And drop a comment. Do you think Elizabeth Holmes genuinely believed the technology would eventually work, or did she know it was a lie from the start? Thanks for watching Financial Collapse. I'll see you in the next one.